Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we grab your sources, peel back the layers, and get you informed quickly.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into the first 100 days of the second Trump administration.
Yes, specifically zeroing in on major shifts in immigration policy and this huge piece of legislation recently passed by the House, often called the One Big Beautiful Bill.
And for this deep dive, you've given us quite a stack of material. We've been digging into analysis from the Brookings Institution, official statements from the White House, reporting from PBS and AP News, and also some fresh data from a national poll by the Marquette Law School.
So our mission is pretty clear. What do these sources collectively tell us? What are the really significant changes happening in immigration? How are they being implemented, on the ground?
And what's actually inside this massive new bill?
Exactly. And importantly, how's the public reacting to all this?
It's a dynamic and complex picture, definitely. We're looking at major shifts happening at the physical border in enforcement efforts inside the U.S. through significant legislative action and also facing ongoing legal and public challenges.
Okay, let's roll up our sleeves and start unpacking this stack. We'll begin with the shifting landscape of immigration in these first 100 days, drawing heavily from that Brookings Institution analysis.
Right. And one of the most dramatic changes the sources highlight immediately is the sheer decline in border flows. Remember the numbers from the Biden administration? Sources like the CBO estimated around, 3.3 million net migration in 2023, much higher than historical norms.
Huge number.
Significantly driven by humanitarian entries.
The Brookings shows a sharp contrast now. A significant decline starting in 2024 and continuing right into early 2025. And what really jumps out is the detail that authorities are now allowing, and I'm quoting here, almost no humanitarian migrants across the border. That feels like a fundamental shift.
It is, exactly. And tools that facilitated some level of orderly processing, like the CBP One app.
Right, for appointments.
Used by asylum seekers to make appointments at ports of entry, they've been ended. And strikingly, the sources note around 30,000 existing appointments were just abruptly canceled.
Wow, just canceled.
Yeah. And it goes beyond just asylum at the immediate border, right?
Right.
Brookings points to the shuttering of specific humanitarian parole programs, mentioning the CHNV program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans.
Though it's worth noting, the courts did step in there.
Yes, they did step in to temporarily halt the termination for roughly 530,000 people who were already here under CHNV. So there's that legal check happening.
Okay. But this really brings up a core tension the sources seem to grapple with. On one hand, perspectives influencing policy argue the asylum system was, quote, outstripping its intended use, creating backlogs and unmanageable flows.
Right, that's the argument.
But then the sources also remind us, of the U.S. obligation under international declarations, like Article 14 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to at least consider asylum claims.
And these new policies, particularly at the border, they appear to effectively remove that consideration process almost entirely.
Interesting tension, yeah. And beyond the border itself, the sources also note the formal international refugee program has essentially been halted.
Yes, an executive order back in January suspended it entirely. Now, there was maybe a glimmer for about 10,000 vetted individuals.
Yeah, whose flights were canceled.
Exactly. A circuit court allowed their admission, but the sources suggest funding suspensions might make even that difficult to actually implement.
So maybe not even those 10,000.
Potentially. And this is a huge break with decades of commitment. The U.S. averaged around 73,000 refugee admissions annually between 1975 and 2024. A big change.
And there was that specific detail tucked into the Brookings piece that stood out to me, a signal of intent to consider refugee status for white South Africans, despite this broader moratorium. That feels like a very targeted exception, doesn't it?
It does. It certainly reads that way in the analysis. Shifting gears slightly to border enforcement itself. The sources indicate that while those surreptitious crossings, entries without inspection are hard to track precisely.
Always are.
They've likely declined, too. And there's definitely a bolstered physical presence. Nearly 7,000 military troops and also deputized state National Guards.
And that huge land transfer, too. About 110,000 acres of borderland turned over to the military for 3 years. That's significant.
It is. But interestingly, despite that increased presence, the sources note that encounters between agents and migrants between the ports of entry have actually fallen.
So fewer attempts, maybe.
That seems to be the suggestion. Fewer attempts overall in those more remote areas, which kind of aligns with the drop in the more organized flows we were just talking about.
Okay, so the picture at the border is one of significantly reduced flows, humanitarian processing halted.
Yeah.
What about the system for regular legal migration? Brookings uses that phrase I liked. Sand in the gears.
It's a good analogy, I think. The fundamental legal framework, largely set by Congress way back, laws mostly from 1990.
Right.
Brookings describes it as having limits that are just far too low with significant economic costs, leaving, quote, virtually no legal pathways for most would-be migrants.
So the system was already limited.
Exactly. But the current administration is adding administrative friction on top of that.
Like cutting USCIS staff. The agency that processes legal applications.
Yeah, cutting staff there, which the sources say will likely just exacerbate the already existing backlogs.
Makes sense.
And then there are these policy changes that might seem small but are quite significant, like updating forms to eliminate a non-binary gender option.
Which triggered a lawsuit, the sources said.
It did already triggered a lawsuit. And they also apparently intend to request social media handles on forms, even citizenship applications, and screen for specific political viewpoints like anti-Semitic activity.
Plus requiring this extreme vetting, which sounds like it just threatens more delays for visas and green cards.
Pretty much. It sounds like they're making the existing, already limited legal process even more difficult and, well, lengthy.
And this extends to temporary workers and higher education too, right?
Exactly. U.S. businesses, they rely heavily on programs like H-1B for skilled tech workers or H-2A for agriculture.
Crucial programs for some sectors.
Very. And the Project 2025 blueprint, which the sources identify as, influencing the administration's agenda, calls for rule changes to dramatically reduce these visas.
And while the sources mentioned there might be some internal debate within the administration about enacting those broad reductions right now.
Yeah, not fully implemented yet, maybe.
Higher education is definitely facing uncertainty. It's a huge sector, $56 billion a year?
Yeah.
Significantly dependent on international students.
Absolutely. Project 2025, for instance, advocated withholding student visas from specific countries like China. Now, this hasn't been broadly implemented yet, according to the sources, but they do highlight specific actions, like the abrupt revocation of over 1,800 student visas recently.
Which was later reversed, right?
Later reversed, yes, but still sends a signal. And the explicit threat to deny Harvard the ability to sponsor international students, coupled with highly visible incidents like the videotaped apprehension of that student, Rumesa Öztürk.
Yeah, I saw that.
That could certainly make prospective students think twice about coming to the U.S.
You think so?
Brookings also connects this to a noted contraction of federally supported research, though it is worth noting, just for accuracy.
Okay.
As of February 2025, the raw student visa numbers didn't yet seem negatively impacted, according to one of the figures mentioned in the analysis. So maybe a lagging indicator or maybe not as affected yet.
Okay, interesting nuance there.
Yeah.
So summarizing this first big section, the border is seeing dramatically reduced flows, humanitarian processing basically halted, legal pathways are facing new hurdles, uncertainty, enforcement presence is up, even if actual encounters between ports are down.
Yeah.
What's the key takeaway here?
Well, I think the core insight from the sources here is really a rapid, multi-pronged effort to drastically reduce all forms of immigration, from humanitarian and refugee pathways, potentially impacting temporary and even some legal permanent routes, basically creating friction points throughout the entire system.
Right, a broad slowdown or stop.
Yeah.
Okay, that gives us a sense of the shifts in flows and legal processes. Now, let's turn to what's happening inside the U.S. Interior Enforcement, concerns about due process. This is where that campaign promise of mass deportation really comes into focus, based on the Brookings and ACLU analyses.
Absolutely. And the initial steps, according to the sources, show a significant ramping up. ICE-initiated arrests, which are primarily interior enforcement.
Right, not at the border.
Not at the border. These have more than doubled monthly.
Yeah.
And detention levels are higher, though apparently still constrained by the number of available beds.
Which brings us to the steps being taken to expand that capacity, doesn't it?
It does. The sources detail plans to expand contracts with for-profit prisons, aiming to more than double detention beds. The projected cost mentioned is $45 billion.
$45 billion. That's a massive planned investment in detention.
It is. And they're also expanding the enforcement apparatus itself. The ACLU specifically highlights the tripling of agreements with local law enforcement through that 287G program.
Which basically deputizes local police for immigration tasks.
Essentially, yeah. Deputizing them to act as immigration agents during their regular duties.
And both Brookings and the ACLU mention using a broad array of agencies or actively building a new deportation force by reassigning personnel from other places.
Right. The sources give specific examples. Reportedly, 25% of DEA staff, 80% of ATF personnel reassigned to immigration duties.
That's striking.
Even IRS data is apparently being used, according to Brookings.
Wow. The ACLU analysis goes even further, right? Pointing to potential deployment of federalized National Guard troops.
Yeah, potentially against the will of local officials, and granting police, quote, immunity for civil rights violations during operations like workplace raids and other sweeps.
And there's that quote from Trump in the sources saying migrants aren't civilians.
That's in there.
Another really striking detail mentioned by Brookings is the use of Social Security data. About 6,000 immigrants with valid SSNs reportedly had their status revoked.
Right.
And were then recorded in the Social Security Administration's death file. That sounds highly unusual.
It's certainly described as an unconventional approach in the sources. Plus, there's a new requirement for immigrants 14 and older who've been in the country over 30 days to register, ostensibly for enforcement or encouraging voluntary exits.
Okay, so using all these different mechanisms.
Yeah.
And this ties directly into serious concerns raised by both Brookings and the ACLU about attacks on due process and rights. They describe it as a defiance of longstanding practices and laws.
Definitely. Like revoking the guidance that generally discouraged immigration enforcement at sensitive locations like schools, hospitals, churches. Both analyses mention that change.
And a particularly prominent example highlighted is the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah, that's a big one in the sources. A power traditionally used against citizens of a hostile nation during wartime.
Right.
Being used now to deport alleged gang members to a prison in El Salvador without a court hearing. Brookings notes this case has continued to dominate headlines.
And the Supreme Court had to step in.
Yes. The sources mention the Supreme Court ruling that the government must facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, an El Salvadoran man mistakenly removed despite a court order staying his removal.
And Brookings notes this is potentially weakening broader rights. And that chilling suggestion about relocating U.S. citizens to that same El Salvadoran prison.
Exactly. That's where you see that strong quote from Judge Hardy Wilkinson in the Brookings piece, describing that possibility as shocking to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans still hold dear.
Powerful quote. The ACLU also points to revoking visas and arresting individuals seemingly for political speech, citing cases like Mahmoud Khalil, Badan Khan Suri, and Rumeysa Öztürk.
Arguing these actions chill free speech more broadly.
Right. And Brookings has 3 reported cases of U.S. citizen children being removed with their deported mothers.
The ACLU's analysis directly argues these actions violate fundamental constitutional rights. They point to the Fourth Amendment.
Unreasonable searches and seizures.
Lack of individualized suspicion, racial profiling concerns, referencing past examples like Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona.
And the 5th and 14th Amendments.
Yeah, protecting equal protection, freedom from racial discrimination, plus the Fifth Amendment due process and the suspension clause. That's your right to challenge unlawful detention, habeas corpus.
Right.
Arguing against arbitrary detention or attempts to bypass the normal removal process. The ACLU notes they've previously challenged expansions of expedited removal on these grounds.
And Trump himself is quoted by Brookings saying that giving everyone a trial would take 200 years, sort of suggesting ways around due process, like the Alien Enemies Act or encouraging self-deportation.
Right. That quote is presented as context for these actions.
So despite this huge ramp-up of interior enforcement efforts and the stated goals of mass deportations, the sources also indicate the administration is reportedly disappointed by the actual deportation numbers so far.
Yes, apparently they remain below Biden-era levels. And DHS hasn't updated public data since December, making the current numbers unclear.
Any reasons given for why the numbers might be muted despite the effort?
Brookings suggests several factors. The time needed for arrests and detention, the fact that most immigrants still have a right to a court hearing, the need for diplomatic engagement with other countries to accept deportees.
Logistical challenges too, I imagine.
Exactly. Significant resources required for large-scale operations and logistics. The full effects, Brookings says, could take months or years to really show up in the numbers.
Speaking of courts, the immigration court system has that massive backlog, over 3 million cases. Brookings points out that while logically Expanding the number of judges would help reduce backlogs and maybe lead to more removal orders.
Right. Historically, about half of cases result in removal.
The administration has actually cut back on the number of judges available. That seems counterintuitive if the main goal is speeding up deportations.
It does seem contradictory based on the analysis, and Brookings argues all these actions combined create significant chilling effects.
Not just on those directly targeted.
No, impacting all immigrant communities. Undocumented immigrants might become less likely to send kids to school, seek health care, report crimes because they're afraid. Legal immigrants may fear traveling or even just expressing political opinions.
And that change to sensitive locations guidance is noted as hitting religious communities specifically. One report mentioned estimates 1 in 12 U.S. Christians could be vulnerable or live with someone vulnerable because of immigration status.
Yeah, that's a striking statistic from the sources.
Yeah.
And there are also significant downstream impacts on U.S.-born children. Over 5.6 million live with at least one undocumented parent.
Wow.
And 2.6 million live only with undocumented parents. Brookings notes the child welfare system just isn't required or equipped to handle a large influx from separations and deportations.
So the key insight from this section seems to be, well, there's a clear intent and a major effort to implement mass interior enforcement using a really broad range of tactics.
Definitely.
But these efforts are running into significant legal hurdles, practical challenges, systemic bottlenecks like court backlogs, and they're raising serious due process concerns and creating these wide-reaching chilling effects.
That sums it up well, I think. Which brings us then to this major piece of legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill.
Right. The White House framed it as a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Congress to unite. PBSP reported it narrowly passed the House recently, a major step forward on Trump's agenda.
It's huge, right? Over 1,000 pages.
Massive. And apparently underwent some late changes specifically to win over holdouts within the House majority. Things like boosting the SALT deduction cap, speeding up Medicaid work requirements.
Yeah, some last-minute deal-making, it sounds like. Let's start with the immigration and border provisions, which the White House explicitly states deliver, quote, big, beautiful deportations and permanently secure borders with the largest border security investment in history. Strong language.
Ambitious goals stated there, funding at least 1 million annual removals, ramping up mass deportation operations to a level never before seen. AP reports the goal is 1 million removed annually, housing 100,000 in detention.
It explicitly funds finishing the border wall, citing specific mileage goals from the White House. 701 miles primary wall, 900 river barriers, 629 secondary, 141 vehicle pedestrian barriers.
And the stated purpose is stopping fentanyl, securing the border from dangerous illegal immigrant murderers and rapists, quoting the White House again.
Right. PBS note $5 billion for border security, specifically within the defense funding part of the bill.
And the bill also aims to significantly boost the enforcement workforce.
Yes, funding the hiring of 10,000 new ICE agents, 5,000 customs agents, 3,000 Border Patrol agents, and providing $10,000 bonuses to frontline agents, according to the White House release.
Okay. Moving beyond border security, the White House states the bill protects Medicaid for Americans by kicking 1.4 million illegals off the benefits, framing it as ending benefits for those gaming the system.
So strong immigration components. But as the bill's name suggests, it's much bigger and more beautiful than just immigration. It encompasses huge tax provisions.
Yeah, the White House is touting it as the largest tax cut in American history, claims it'll put an extra $5,000 in people's pockets, lead to a double-digit percentage decrease in taxes, about 15% less for those earning $30,000-$80,000. Big claims.
And a key campaign promise included, no tax on tips and overtime.
Which APPBS report are temporary provisions, though, expiring end of 2028.
That's an important detail, yes. Temporary. It does make permanent the individual income and estate tax cuts from the 2017 law. APPBS confirmed that. The estate tax exemption, for instance, rises significantly to over $15 million plus inflation.
There are temporary boosts, too, like a $1,000 increase in the standard deduction for individuals, $2,000 for joint filers, and a temporary $4,000 increase for seniors, both expiring in 2028 as well.
Right. The child tax credit sees a temporary $500 increase, reaching $2,500 through 2028, before reverting back to $2,000 plus inflation.
And that controversial SALT cap, the state and local tax deduction limit.
That's increased to $40,000 for incomes up to $500,000, phasing down and increasing 1% annually. A key change to win over some representatives, likely.
For businesses, the small business deduction increases to 23%. There's also temporary full expensing of domestic R&D and qualifying assets.
Meaning businesses can immediately deduct the full cost of those investments.
Right. The White House also mentions tax relief for Social Security recipients, repealing the requirement for reporting $600 plus gig economy transactions to the IRS.
That's been a controversial point.
And protecting family farmers from the greedy death tax, claiming over $10 billion in tax cuts there.
Okay, so massive tax cuts. How are they paying for it or offsetting it?
Well, the bill repeals or phases out clean energy credits passed previously. A4CBS note this, and the White House calls them the Green New Scam, claiming huge savings, over $500 billion per year, reversing EV mandates, stopping credits benefiting China.
And boosting fossil fuels and resource extraction.
Yeah, it increases leasing, drilling, mining, logging on public lands, speeds up approvals, cuts royalty rates, framed by the White House as unleashing American energy dominance in mineral development.
Okay. The bill also includes significant spending cuts and introduces new work requirements, right?
It does. The White House claims the largest deficit reduction, with $1.6 trillion in mandatory savings.
Where do those savings come from?
A substantial chunk comes from reducing spending on food, SNAP, by around $267 billion over 10 years. It shifts costs to states, requiring them to shoulder 5% of benefit costs and 75% of administrative costs, a big change from current levels where states pay 0% of benefits and 50% of admin.
That's a major shift onto state budgets.
And it expands SNAP work requirements, extends them to able-bodied adults without dependents up to age 64, up from 54 currently, and parents are now only exempt if caring for a child under 7, tightened from under 18.
Okay, what about Medicaid?
Medicaid faces nearly $700 billion in reduced spending, according to CBO estimates cited by APPBS.
Wow, $700 billion.
And new work requirements starting December 31st, 2026, demanding 80 hours per month of community engagement work, education service for able-bodied adults without dependents, plus verifying eligibility twice a year instead of once.
What's the potential impact of those Medicaid changes?
Well, Democrats quoted in the sources warn millions could lose coverage. And the CBO estimates 8.6 million fewer people will have health care over the decade because of these changes.
Significant impact projected there.
The White House also states the bill ends taxpayer-funded sex change procedures for minors, reversing a previous mandate.
Okay. And there are several other notable provisions tucked in this massive bill covering a wide range of topics.
Yeah, like no taxes on gun silencers, eliminating the $200 tax that's been in place since 1934, supported by the NRA, though groups like Giffords argue it impairs law enforcement response.
It also prohibits Medicaid funds for Planned Parenthood.
Right, which Democrats warn will impact access to other services like cancer screenings, Pap tests, birth control provided there.
And then there's the creation of these Trump Kids $1,000 savings accounts.
Yeah, originally called MAGA accounts, apparently. The government contributes $1,000 for babies born between Jan 1, 2024 and December 31st, 2028. Families can add up to $5 annually. Access is limited before 18. Partial access for education or a first home. Full access only at 30.
Interesting idea. What else?
Includes Made in America incentives, like allowing a full deduction of auto loan interest for American-made vehicles.
But that's temporary too, right? Ending in 2028.
Yes, part of those temporary tax breaks. It also modernizes air traffic control systems.
And defense funding.
Sees a significant boost, around $150 billion, according to APBS. This includes $25 billion for President Trump's Golden Dome for America, Missile Defense Shield,
right?
$21 billion for ammunition, $34 billion for shipbuilding, $9 billion for service member quality of life improvements.
And student loans.
A major overhaul there, too. Aiming for $330 billion in cuts and savings, it replaces existing repayment plans with just two options, a standard one and a less generous repayment assistance plan, and repeals previous regulations on loan cancellation programs.
Okay. And finally, a tax increase on some university endowments.
Yes, up to 21% on some large university endowments mentioned by APPBS.
Wow. That is an extraordinary amount packed into one single piece of legislation.
It really is.
What the sources really show here is a bill that attempts to tackle core administration priorities across, well, almost every sector: immigration, border security, taxes, social programs, defense, energy, education, often pairing spending cuts and these policy changes with broad tax relief measures.
It certainly ties together a lot of disparate goals under one very large roof. Okay, now that we've seen the policy actions in this major legislative push, how does all of this stack up against public opinion? That Marquette Law School poll gives us a snapshot from May 2025.
Right. This poll, conducted May 5/15, surveyed over 1,000 adults, margin of error around plus negative 3.6%. Pretty standard national poll.
So let's look at overall approval for Trump's immigration policy first. Okay. It's split right down the middle. 50% approve, 50% disapprove, net approval of 0.
Interesting.
The poll notes this is actually the second highest approval rating for Trump's handling of various issues. Only border security itself was higher, so relative strength there despite the split.
Okay. What about the general direction of the country?
42% say right direction, 58% say wrong track.
That's
stable since March, the poll says, but it's notably up from just 20% saying right direction back in October 2024. So some improvement in sentiment there.
And trust in Trump?
Also divided. 45% say they totally or mostly trust him, but there's a really sharp partisan divide here. A strong majority of Republicans trust him, while clear majorities of independents and Democrats do not.
That partisan split seems key. What about awareness of the border situation? Do people know crossings are down?
Mostly, yes. 68% overall say crossings are down, though awareness varies quite a bit by party. 84% of Republicans say they're down, compared to 61% of Democrats and only 45% of independents.
Interesting gap there, especially with independents.
The polls also asked about some of those more controversial proposals we touched on earlier. The idea of incarcerating U.S. citizens in an El Salvador prison.
What do people think of that?
Opposed by 60%, only 40% favor it. But again, the partisan split is stark. Nearly two-thirds of Republicans favor it, while majorities of independents and Democrats oppose.
Okay. And the Greenland idea, taking control of Greenland.
Much stronger opposition there. 73% oppose, only 27% favor. Even among Republicans, while nearly half, 49%, are in favor, it's still not a majority supporting it.
Got it. Turning to economic views, particularly related to the bill's components, what about tariffs?
58% say tariffs hurt the U.S. economy versus 32% who say they help. Pretty stable overall. The Republicans have become more positive on tariffs since March, and independents more negative, and 61% favor requiring congressional approval for tariffs.
Okay. What about inflation? Big concern for many.
Yeah, 61% believe Trump's policies will increase inflation, while only 28% think they'll decrease it. Republicans have actually become less optimistic about a decrease since December.
And looking ahead,
63% expect inflation to increase in the next 12 months. That view is held strongly by independents and Democrats, while Republicans are more divided on the outlook.
Okay, the federal deficit. It's a component of the bill's framing.
Right. It isn't the most important issue for most people. Only 4% chose it first. But 53% say reducing it is very important. The poll notes this creates a potential conflict with other public preferences on taxes and spending.
How so?
Well, opinions are split on whether Congress and Trump will ultimately reduce the deficit, 48% think so, or increase it, 52%. Big partisan gap here, too. 78% of Republicans expect a reduction compared to just 18% of Democrats.
And what about how people want to deal with the deficit or just tax policy in general?
This is where it gets really interesting. Majorities actually favor increasing taxes on high earners, defined as $600K plus, and corporations.
Okay.
And majorities also favor eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits and tips, things included in the bill. A majority also favors extending the 2017 tax cuts, another part of the bill.
So a bit of a mixed bag on taxes, wanting cuts for some, increases for others.
Exactly. And when it comes to spending cuts, it's even clearer. Majorities are willing to cut spending on federal employees and NASA space programs.
Okay. What about defense?
They are not willing to cut defense, but by a smaller margin than other areas.
And the big entitlement programs?
Yeah.
Or things like Medicaid?
Large majorities strongly oppose cuts to medical research, Medicaid, Social Security, or Medicare.
That's a really interesting point from the poll, isn't it? While the bill includes those significant cuts to programs like SNP and Medicaid.
Right, hundreds of billions.
Public opinion seems strongly against cuts to those specific areas.
Definitely seems like a potential disconnect there, highlighted by the poll data.
Absolutely. Finally, what about approval for the parties in Congress?
Republicans in Congress have 43% approval, 57% disapproval, a slight drop since March. Democrats in Congress have much lower approval at 29%, with 71% disapproving, which is unchanged.
And within their own parties?
The poll highlights that Republican approval of their own party in Congress is very high, 81%. Much higher than Democrat approval of their party in Congress, which is only 49%.
Interesting dynamic there. So the overall picture from the poll is complex. Public opinion on Trump's immigration policy is split, but relatively high compared to other issues he handles. People are generally aware border crossings are down, but they seem wary of some of the more controversial enforcement ideas floated.
Right.
And while they want deficit reduction in principle, their preferences for how to achieve it through tax increases on the wealthy corporations and definitely avoiding cuts to popular programs like Medicaid and Social Security seem to diverge quite a bit from some key aspects of the big, beautiful bill.
Yeah, that divergence seems like a key takeaway.
Yeah.
Okay, that brings us then to the resistance and challenges, primarily highlighted in the ACLU analysis we looked at.
Right. And they acknowledge upfront that courts have sometimes protected immigrant rights, even with Trump-appointed judges on the bench, but they caution this shouldn't be overstated as the primary line of defense.
So what is, according to them?
Their core argument is that Congress has a crucial role. They say Congress can and must use the power of the purse and oversight to counter actions they see as problematic.
Power of the purse. How specifically?
They suggest concrete actions through the appropriations process. Things like limiting ICE's budget, denying supplemental funds for mass detentions, prohibiting funding for family detention specifically, defunding mass detention camps altogether.
And oversight tied to funding.
Exactly. Requiring notification before expanding detention sites, conditioning funding on allowing members of Congress access for site visits to ensure accountability.
And crucially, preventing the diversion of funds, right?
Sure.
Like taking money from defense budgets, for example, for immigration enforcement activities that Congress didn't explicitly authorize.
Precisely. That's a key point they make. Aggressive oversight is also central to their strategy, holding hearings, grilling officials, issuing subpoenas to detect and expose potential abuses.
Okay. What about immigration reform itself?
On reform, the ACLU argues that creating a path to citizenship for the millions of undocumented immigrants should be a non-negotiable demand, and that opponents should proactively go on offense with their own solutions, like increasing capacity for screening and receiving people humanely at the border rather than just focusing on enforcement.
And they point to public opinion research to back this up.
They do. They cite a March 2024 poll showing 66% reject an asylum ban and 79% oppose family separation. Their own research, they say, suggests a balanced approach combining border management and citizenship pathways actually outperforms purely fear-based messaging. They claim 68% of voters want this kind of balanced approach.
Which seems to echo some of the nuances we saw in the Marquette poll regarding public preferences, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. A desire for order, but maybe not the harshest measures. Legal challenges are, of course, definitely expected and a major part of the resistance strategy.
Like challenging family separation if it were attempted again.
Absolutely. The ACLU states they would immediately challenge any attempts to reinstate a family separation policy, arguing it violates the Imazell v. ICE settlement from previous legal battles.
What else are they anticipating challenging?
Attempts to dismantle the asylum system, they argue, violate existing asylum law and the Administrative Procedure Act, noting they've successfully blocked similar policies before. Abusive border patrol tactics or potential vigilantism, they say, violate the Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures.
And attempts to bypass normal removal procedures, like using expedited removal more broadly.
They argue that would violate the Fifth Amendment due process rights and the suspension clause related to habeas corpus, and they explicitly state they expect to challenge any attacks on birthright citizenship.
The 14th Amendment.
Arguing it clearly violates the 14th Amendment and will be defended vigorously in court. Similarly, they say they will defend the Plyler v. Doe Supreme Court ruling that guarantees equal access to public education for all children, regardless of status, citing potential violations of the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, and state laws if it's challenged.
So a multi-front legal defense plan.
Yeah.
What about resistance at the state and local level?
That's also crucial, according to the ACLU analysis, partly because the federal administration will likely need state and local participation for some of its plans, like expanding the 287G program.
So the ACLU urges them to refuse.
Yes, urging state and local officials to refuse to participate in mass detentions and arrests. They also advocate for passing local laws against contracting with ICE for detention facilities, supporting community movements against new detention sites.
And documenting abuses.
Yes, actively documenting and tracking abuses by CBP and potential vigilantes. And importantly, working with local officials to coordinate practical support for families impacted by enforcement, things like helping find loved ones, providing childcare and food, and funding or coordinating deportation defense legal services.
Practical, on-the-ground resistance and support.
Exactly. Finally, the ACLU emphasizes the need to reclaim the narrative, basically, to win the public debate.
Yeah.
This involves, in their view, debunking and rejecting the administration's premises, calling out xenophobia and racism where they see it, and highlighting that the proposed approach goes against fundamental American values.
So using public discourse as a tool.
Right. They suggest Congress could hold hearings specifically showcasing the positive contributions of immigrants and emphasizing the need for a fair and humane process as part of that narrative fight.
Okay, so the key insight from this section is that alongside the administration's very rapid push for change through policy and legislation, there is significant organized resistance being planned and presumably executed across multiple fronts.
Yeah, through legal challenges, leveraging congressional power, encouraging non-cooperation at state and local levels, all tied into this ongoing fight for the public narrative.
It sets up quite a dynamic. Which brings us full circle, almost, to the broader economic and societal implications that Brookings touched on.
Exactly. And bringing it all together, Brookings projects a significant decline in net immigration overall, potentially even leading to net negative migration for the first time in decades if these policies fully take hold.
And the sources warn the impacts could be pretty substantial, economically speaking.
Yeah, reduced GDP growth, potentially contributing to a recession, labor shortages in key sectors like agriculture, construction, services sectors that often rely heavily on immigrant labor.
And it adds to concerns about the Social Security Trust Fund.
Right, which is already projected to face exhaustion around 2035. Immigrants traditionally contribute significantly to it through payroll taxes, so reduced immigration could worsen that outlook.
And this view stands in pretty stark contrast to the sort of traditional economic view of immigration, doesn't it?
It really does. Economists, by and large, have lauded immigration for boosting growth, dynamism, driving population growth, which is key for the U.S., enabling social mobility, fueling innovation and entrepreneurship. All factors often cited as contributing to America's economic primacy historically.
Beyond the pure economics, those chilling effects we talked about earlier have wider societal impacts, too.
Definitely. Inhibiting undocumented immigrants from seeking school, healthcare, or reporting crimes because they're afraid. Making legal immigrants fearful about international travel, or even just expressing political opinions safely.
And the change in sensitive locations guidance, specifically noted as affecting religious communities, making places of worship feel less safe for immigrant members or those with immigrant family.
Yes, and those downstream impacts on U.S.-born children are a significant concern highlighted by Brookings, especially the over 2.6 million kids living only with undocumented parents. The child welfare system, they argue, is just ill-equipped to handle a potential large influx resulting from mass separations or deportations.
Finally, Brookings touches on the lingering global impacts. What's the message being sent internationally?
Well, the analysis suggests it's now crystal clear to immigrants and potential immigrants worldwide that U.S. policies and promises can change extremely abruptly, basically with the stroke of a pen, and that the risk of severe consequences, like the potential mention of being sent to a foreign prison, is real.
And that could shift migration patterns.
That's the argument. A sufficiently hostile environment, Brookings suggests, could shift talent and migration flows away from the U.S. towards places like Canada, Europe, maybe even China. This could potentially help those nations become new economic powerhouses and squander a historical U.S. advantage in attracting global talent.
Raising fundamental questions about America's image.
Exactly. Raising questions, they imply, about whether the idea of America as that shining city on a hill still holds true for prospective immigrants around the world.
Wow. That really puts the potential scale of the consequences into perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. It paints a picture of incredibly rapid, ambitious shifts happening across the board, but facing significant headwinds from existing systems, legal challenges, conflicting public opinion preferences, and potentially major long-term consequences.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, we've looked at these significant changes in immigration policy in the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. We've seen a dramatic reduction in flows at the border, a halting of refugee programs.
Right, contrasted with the major ramping up of interior enforcement tactics that, according to the sources, raise significant due process questions, even if the deportation numbers haven't fully matched the stated goals just yet.
And we've unpacked this massive One Big Beautiful Bill that recently passed the House, seeing how it aims to pair those ambitious immigration enforcement goals and border security investments with really sweeping tax cuts.
Significant spending reductions in areas like food aid and Medicaid, which face public opposition according to the polls, and just a wide array of other policy priorities bundled together.
We've also layered in that public opinion landscape from the Marquette poll, showing a mixed but maybe surprisingly, relatively favorable view on Trump's immigration policies specifically.
Compared to other issues.
But also revealing significant public opposition to certain controversial proposals, and this potential misalignment between public preferences on tax and spending cuts and the actual specifics contained within the bill.
And we explored the criticisms and the anticipated legal and political challenges highlighted by the ACLU analysis, focusing on the potential roles of the courts, congressional power, state and local resistance, and that ongoing fight for the public narrative.
It's clear from this stack of sources that there is just a monumental push for rapid change happening across multiple fronts, with really significant implications for individuals, families, communities.
And even the broader economy and America's standing in the world, as Brookings points out.
The sources definitely reveal a palpable tension, don't they, between the speed and the sheer ambition of these policy shifts and the existing legal frameworks, the constitutional rights involved, the practical realities on the ground, and the diverse, sometimes contradictory public opinions about it all.
Absolutely. So, given the scale of the changes being attempted and the significant challenges and resistance already emerging that we've discussed, what questions does this deep dive raise for you? Maybe about which of these policies will ultimately stick? Which ones might actually be implemented versus challenged successfully?
Yeah, and who will be most affected in the long term? And maybe, fundamentally, whether the really ambitious goals laid out, particularly in that big bill and the enforcement plans, are actually achievable within the U.S. system of checks and balances, legal constraints, and public opinion as it currently exists.